Hello readers, and welcome back to Tale Between Tales. Today we need to talk about Olive Kitteridge and this book. this book that we read for book club is possibly the worst book I've ever read. Let's find out why. All right, so this book did not work for me on any level, and it didn't work for any of my book club members either. Like, half of them DNF'd it. I think only me and maybe one other person actually finished it. And I will talk about why I think that is the case at the end of the video. But let's look at what this book, at least what I think this book was trying to do. So this book is about Olive Kitteridge, who is aging, and it seems to be trying to tell the story about getting older and reflecting back on your life and kind of coming to terms with how your life has played out and what impact you've had on other people as you enter your elderly years. This book is in the format of several short stories, and to kind of keep a cohesive thread through all of them, Olive Kitteridge is mentioned in every single story, and at some points, it seems like the book is trying to tell a cohesive story. We've got several of the short stories are told from Olive's perspective, and they seem to be in chronological order, detailing some of the events like after she's retired and moving on. Those seem to kind of be telling like the story of her elderly years. But mostly this book just feels very disjointed and very disconnected. And it seems to be trying to tell us how one person's life can affect and impact other people, and you don't really know the impact that you have on other people, but it doesn't actually succeed in doing this, because a lot of the stories that mention Olive seem to be just like token mentions. Like, there's a story about a piano player, and Olive and her husband come and eat at the restaurant like pretty frequently that this piano player plays at, and that's the only connection that she has to Olive. That's the only mention of her, and then her story is completely different. And then there also mentions several students of hers, because she was a teacher, and there's several stories that have past references to students, and you're like, oh, well, you know, the whole, I don't know if it's a trope or the idea of a teacher can really impact their students' lives, but that is not what happens in these stories. Each individual story is just a fragmented section of what is currently going on in these students' lives, and like usually it's just mentioned as, oh, this reminds me of my high school math teacher, Olive, and that's it. There's no other connection. She imparted no lasting wisdom. She's not brought up because it helps them in a moment or anything. It's more like them remembering, oh, she was really stern and I didn't really like her. And it's very disconnected. It's like, why are you even bringing this up? Also, the biggest beef I have with this book is that every single story is so depressing. Nothing good happens in this book. Like, you have a book of a collection of like maybe 15 short stories. None of them have anything to do with each other, and none of them even come to a satisfying conclusion. It's just like a little snippet out of somebody's life, and you're like, wait, well, what happens next? Like, what's going on? Like, why did it, there's nothing. It's just like no backstory and no future story. There's like, here's this terrible thing that happened, and now we're moving on. And you're like, why am I reading this? This has absolutely no point to it. And so I'm going to give you just some very, very light spoilers, because there are so many of these short stories, but I'm going to talk about just a couple of them in kind of vague senses, so you can kind of get an idea of some of the things that are going on in these stories. So, like, the very first story that you get is told from her husband's point of view, and the story that it focuses on is a time in his life when he was at the height of his career, and he's a pharmacist working at like the local drugstore, and he hires an assistant to help him out because he's overwhelmed with work and he needs an assistant. And he basically, the story is about him falling in love with his assistant, and like all of his feeling neglected because most of his thoughts and attention and affection are going towards this person that he hired. And yet he doesn't cheat on Olive, but he doesn't, like, he loves this other girl, and he kind of realizes that he loves her, and Olive figures it out, and so they're fighting. And then like his assistant figures it out and is kind of trying to like want to start a fling, but he's like, no, I can't do that because I'm married to Olive, which good for him. But it's just this weird dynamic, and I don't know, it was just kind of a weird way to start the book. And it kind of goes through what happens with his assistant getting married and later on, and how he helps her and the money he gives her, and just all of that. And you're like, I'm not entirely sure what this has to do with the main plot of the book, which there is no plot to the book because all of the stories don't have anything to do with each other. And so you never really see Olive's husband again. That's it. That's all you get. It's just this snippet about a terrible time in his life when he was being tempted. And I don't even know if it's like he overcame it. It's more he kind of just learned to live with it. And so anyway, the book moves on. And then you have like this story about one of her past students who's planning to commit suicide, and he's got the gun in the back of his car, and he's just waiting. He's like contemplating. He went back to his hometown, and he's sitting in the car looking at the sea, and then Olive comes in and talks to him, and then they see someone fall into the sea. So they go rush out and pull her out of the sea, and that's it. You're like, well, did that change this character? Is he still gonna go commit suicide? Like, what was that? There's no after effect. Like, the guy is still depressed. His dad still, or his mom, one of his parents had committed suicide. Like nothing's changed in his life. We don't know how this event affected him at all. We don't know anything. And so I'm just like, what is the point of this? You have to give us some kind of a conclusion. We don't know. We don't know. Maybe that's the conclusion, is that you don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. It was ridiculous. And then there was one seemingly happy story about an elderly couple, and I was like, oh, finally, like this cute elderly couple, and they love each other, and they're so cute, and they're getting older, and they're spending so much time together and going to see these, like, the symphony, and they go out to eat, and they do go on walks together, and then at the end of the story, it's like they run into this other people. They're like, oh, well, that time that I saw you in this airport. And she's like, well, when were you in this airport? And turns out that like 15 or 20 years ago, he like cheated on her and didn't tell her about it. And so it's like this huge bomb that's dropped. And she's like, what? You did this? How could you do this? And he's like, well, it was so long ago. Doesn't even matter. We're old. And so, let's just keep things the way they are. And like, that's the conclusion, is that we're too old to do anything about it. And so you shouldn't even be mad at me because you're old too, and we're too old to deal with this now. And I'm like, what kind of a stupid story and message is that? I'm like, okay, so apparently old people have no rights to the way they feel, or no rights to wanting like conclusions, or their partner to like own up and take accountability and resolve something. Like, she's upset, and in the end she's like, oh yeah, my husband's right, I'm super old and can't do anything about it. And I'm like, okay, like, what a weird story. And I don't know what Olive has to do with that either. So nothing. She has nothing to do with that. And then there's another story about a couple who are empty nesters, and the wife is like, oh, I'm done messing around in the bedroom. And it's like, oh, well, when our kids left, like, my wife just like came alive, and she's in all of these clubs, and she's so happy, and I'm so miserable because I just loved having all my kids around, and now they're gone. and my wife won't even, I don't get enough from my wife because she's happy doing all of her other things now. And like it wasn't a big sacrifice for her wife. I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I totally get that, like, yeah, I'm spending like 20 plus years putting my life, I'm not necessarily on hold, but like sacrificing that time to really just do what you want to do with the kids. And then when she gets out of that and the kids leave, she's like, I have all this time to do all this stuff. And she's like super happy. And her husband's like, oh, baby, I'm so depressed. And I'm like, whatever, get over it. And then so apparently he's like super mad because his wife doesn't want to fool around in bed anymore. And so he goes and finds a girlfriend on the side to get his needs met. And I'm like, this is a stupid story too. It's like, I hate all these stories. Like, I hate the stories about the old people. I hate the stories about the young people. I hate this book. It's like, this book is just awful. It's just the worst. And then there's like a couple stories about delinquent kids, or like parents and being weird to their kids and like trapped in this weird situation, and like siblings running off or like wanting to commit suicide. And I'm like, well, what does Olive have to do with all of that? It's like nothing. It doesn't have anything to do with all of that. It's just a dumb book with dumb stories that have no beginnings and no endings and a whole bunch of cliffhangers that leave you feeling angry. So if that's the point of the book, then it did a good job. But if the point of the book is to reflect on your past life, or to like talk about like the effects of coming up on the end of your life, I mean, it did a bad job. It's terrible. There's nothing good. I'm like, not everybody's life is 100% misery. Like, put something positive in this book. Not everybody cheats on their wife. Like, yeah, it happens. Not everybody needs to like kill themselves. Not everybody like, I mean, just come on. It's like every single story is awful. And this book won the Pulitzer Prize Award. I'm like, why? Why? I don't know. All I can conclude is that I am not the audience for this book. We decided in our book club that we are the wrong generation to read this book, and this book is not targeted for us. This book is like 1.5 generations up from me, like the aging generation of people who I think are in their like 70s is apparently the generation that connected much more with this book. And so my recommendation is that if you're younger than like 75, don't read this book. Anyway, but maybe you loved it. Tell me in the comments below why I'm wrong and why you loved it, and we will see you next time. Bye.